So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for those of you who are not in British Columbia. I'm Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly. I'm a professor in the School of Public Administration here at the University of Victoria, and I'm delighted to welcome you on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen people where the University of Victoria stands. And I acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territories the University of Victoria stands, as well as the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wassanak people whose historical relationship to the land continues to this day. And I would like to acknowledge that I am actually speaking from Sit Shalnath, which is a little location also known as Willows Beach, where I live. And despite the 2 centimeters of snow that we have today in British Columbia, obviously where we are is the most beautiful place in the world, I believe. And with this, I would like to first very briefly introduce some of the speakers that we have today, and then talk to you a little bit about the origin of this book that we're going to discuss today. So Michael Carpenter is a postdoctoral fellow with the Borders in Globalization Lab here at the University of Victoria, and he's the lead co-editor of this book. Melissa Kelly is a research chair in migration and integration at the Toronto Metropolitan University in Ontario. And Oliver Schmidtke is also one of the co-editors with Michael and Melissa of this book, and he's a professor here at the University of Victoria and also the director of the Center for Global Studies. Scott Watson is also a professor here in political science at the University of Victoria, and Asad Kiyani is as well a professor at the University of Victoria in the Faculty of Law. Now, the book that we are introducing to you today started with some questions that were raised originally in 2015 at a time when there was a huge, in a way, crisis in Europe, in parts because the European Union hadn't seen some of the mobility and migration that took place at the time across the Mediterranean region and also across some of the land at the time. And originally, when the project started, we had organized a workshop in Brussels at the time to launch that project. And we had a number of questions that were raised by this sudden, in a way, discovery that, mobility was at the doors of Europe, basically, but also questions about the European Union itself, and then obviously a number of questions on the consequences of this policy challenge for the EU and for other states across the world. And we thought it would be really interesting to look at Mexico, look at the US, at Canada, and Japan otherwise as well. And some of the figures that we had and some of the questions that we had was, what are the causes of increased migration towards the European Union? And some of the things that were at the time very surprising, right, was the huge increase in migration from about 100,000 to, in 2014, 250,000 people trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, but also trying to enter the EU and being attracted by the EU. And some of the southern states were as well concerned, such as, for instance, Morocco. But in 2015, the numbers obviously explode, and some of you will know that these numbers have increased and been documented to almost reach 2 million. Certainly, the people who were able to enter the EU reached 1.2 or 1.4 million, depending on the data that people look at. Another challenge at the time was that certain regions of Europe were really affected, right? So one of the things that really surprised a lot of analysts was that the traditional point of entry, which was Spain and Portugal through Morocco, was not the case. It was not the case anymore, but it was really happening through Greece and across Turkey and so on and so forth, and some other countries, obviously, within the European Union and through continental Europe. However, the focus on the Syrian crisis, which was in the media up front, were blurred a little bit the data, because very quickly when people looked at the details of that data, one of the things that appeared was that the people who were actually part of this phenomenon came from many different countries. And there were many policy challenges, including, for instance, something as simple as the ability to speak to those people, because they came from countries like Somalia and Bangladesh and Pakistan and Afghanistan, Eritrea and Syria and so on and so forth. And so they were really, in a way, dramatic and challenging policy issues here. So a couple of questions that were specific to the European Union at the time was that, where's their policy options? Were there policy solutions that were raised, and were they going to fundamentally change the nature of the union and the partnership among the states, but also were they going to radically change the nature of policies in the EU? And this is one aspect I think is very important in our book, is that when we look at one crisis, but we start comparing with other states, as I said, for instance, Canada, the US, Mexico, Japan, what we realize is that this phenomenon of increased migration into certain countries was not unique to the EU and was really a global phenomenon, maybe at a scale that was less important, but certainly that had spillover effect across the world. And so looking at those policies became one of the focus of this book. And I think the book comes up with really interesting questions with this. Some of the questions for the EU, for instance, was that going to be the end of, for instance, the Schengen policy or the Dublin Agreement, right, which have been in debates ever since, and in a way continue to be rewritten regularly. So the book obviously doesn't exclusively focus on the EU at all, because it's a comparative book and we look at it from a Canadian perspective. So, a number of the chapters in the book are really looking at the impact of migration in different countries in comparative perspective, and really raise a number of really interesting questions with regard to policy. Some of those, I think, the authors are going to address, and I will prod a little bit, but I just want to give you a sense of some of the ideas that are discussed and are in a way presented throughout the book and come with quite some strength, I would say, across the different chapters, is that most of the countries that we look at actually struggle with the policies that address, increased migration in the country. And that there is a bit of a short-term approach to those policies across the different countries. In other words, policymakers look at this like a crisis. They do not assume that this is in a way, a 21st century phenomenon that is there to stay. And so the kind of policy decisions that they make are also short-term. And so with that, I think, I kind of raise one of the, I think, core issue about this debate is how do we deal with migration across the world, and how countries have reacted to this over the last now nearly 10 years. And with this, I'll handle the microphone to Michael Carpenter. Michael, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. I just wanted to start by saying how grateful I am for the support that I've had in this project, and all the work from my co-editors and all the great work from our authors who we put together this great ensemble of contributions. Also, a big thanks to the Center for Global Studies here. Amanda and Jody are always supportive in helping make this possible. And the Borders and Globalization Research Program, where I'm doing a postdoc, has been incredibly supportive of this project too, and other things that I'm working on. And Emmanuel, in particular, I want to thank you for your support throughout and for your great concluding chapter in the book as well. So I'd like to just talk for a few minutes, and I think we'll each just go for maybe 5 or 6 or 7 minutes, hopefully not too much more. If any of us ramble too much, please, Emmanuel, cut us off. I'd like to just say a few things about the big picture of the book and about the great contributions that you'll find in it. You probably heard that there was a bit of a snow issue here, so the campus is shut down, at least for the morning. We were supposed to have a bookseller on site with offering book copies for sale. So that's not happening, but there is a promo code. If anyone is interested in purchasing a version of this book from the publisher's website, there's a promo code that's active for a month, and it's Borders15. That's Borders15, capital B, Borders15, one word, and that'll get you 15% off of purchase copies. So this is a book about borders and migration. It's about bridging the research literatures of border studies and migration studies. It's about exploring some of the contemporary challenges and debates around these issues, taking Canada as a sort of prism or lens or set of case studies for considering comparatively. So most of the chapters do focus on Canadian context, though set within a wider international and global context, with a few chapters focusing on faraway places and events that help to provide some important background and comparative perspective. We take the view, or at least the editors take the view, and we elaborate this in our co-authored introduction, that borders and migration are not in opposition. Okay, and we try to break down that dichotomy of borders or migration. You know, we take the view that borders aren't inherently anti-migration, and migration is not inherently anti-borders. It's a question rather of good governance, and borders can be governed in such a way that makes them more open and more democratic, even in ways that move more towards a universal right of migration. And we think this is an important point because sometimes in the literature or the public sphere or among activists or even among some scholars, there are calls for more liberal migration that amount to a call for no borders or calling for a borderless world. And we worry that however laudable a goal, a world without borders would be, it may be unduly saddling reformist goals, good reformist goals, with more revolutionary or anarchist baggage that might be a little bit more difficult to achieve or build consensus around. So we want to specify borders and migration, not borders or migration, as kind of a focal point for this book. As Emmanuel said, the origin goes back a few years to a workshop held by the Jean Monnet Network. The workshop was Canada's Border and Migration Policies in Comparative Perspective. Following that, we reached out to participants. We invited them to join, to write a chapter about their current research or advancing their current research around borders and migration issues. We asked them to pay attention to policy concerns, and we asked them to pay attention to global implications. And the result is this diverse volume with authors from diverse backgrounds in the social sciences, humanities, and law, as well as non-academic backgrounds, some with professional experience in related civil society and industry sectors. I want to say, to give an overview of the book's chapters and contributions, I'll just run through the major parts of the book. In the first chapter, Dr. Oliver Schmidtke, migration scholar, co-editor of the volume here today, he sets the stage in this first chapter with an overview, a great overview of Canada's immigration issues and data, focusing on a detailed analysis of the temporary foreign workers program and some of the governance and humanitarian challenges surrounding that. Then the scope of the book widens a bit with the second chapter by Dr. Scott Watson. He's an international relations specialist. He's also here at UVic. And his chapter is a critique of global regimes of migrant rights and protections, of which Canada has been a self-interested and rather conservative champion, as I think we'll probably hear in a few minutes. Then there's a chapter by political scientist Dr. Chan Mutlu at Acadia University. He establishes the context of the dramatic rise in forced migration, focusing especially on the Syrian crisis and how Europe closed its external borders, largely due to a situation that was resolved or dealt with in part by a very controversial 2016 agreement between the EU and Turkey, in which effectively the EU paid off Turkey to block asylum seekers from reaching Europe rather. So this is an important sort of catalyzing event that helps to set the stage for a lot of what's happening in much of the rest of the world, including Canada. Those first three chapters establish the Canadian context, the international context, and some of these catalyzing events that set the refugee movements in motion. The next three chapters of the book draw attention to some of the ways that states regularly and sometimes creatively shirk their humanitarian and legal responsibilities and obligations towards asylum seekers. So in her chapter, Dr. Birte Wassenberg of the University of Strasbourg, a historian, shows us how EU states went to great lengths to harden the borders between them within Europe in an effort to restrict movement even as the need for asylum was rising. And then we'll hear from, the next chapter is Dr. Asad Kiyani at the Faculty of Law here at UVic, and he breaks down the demerits of the so-called Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the US, which was meant to limit the options of asylum seekers in North America. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that. And in the next chapter, another legal scholar, Dr. Donald Galloway, also from UVic here, retired, he takes on the Canadian courts for, amounts to an imminent critique of Canada's judicial approach to oversight on immigration policy. And he's very critical of the courts for standing off. And really, he argues that the court's position of deferring to the executive branch for issues of migration is allowing xenophobia to potentially influence government policy in ways that he argues courts should step in to review, really. The next three chapters of the book offer glimpses of new or alternative ways of thinking about migration and migration governance in the 21st century. So in her chapter, Sabine Lair, she's a civil society, community-based practitioner here in BC, and she's worked extensively with individuals and groups involved with Canada's private sponsorship program for refugees. And she writes about this in her chapter, about some of the promise and perils also of leaning too heavily on the citizenry in resettlement programs. Then industry specialist Solomon Wong, based in Vancouver, he breaks down some fascinating emerging trends in pre-clearance technologies for travelers, technologies that extend the bordering process further out in space and even in time. Then sociologist Dr. Victoria Simmons uses a Mexican case study to show how humanitarian borders can function, how borders can serve as humanitarian governance instruments in assisting migration, and how counterintuitively states can actually strengthen their territorial sovereignty by increasing the capacity of migrants to pass across their borders. So a very interesting analysis there, again, coming back to one of our core themes, that migration and borders aren't inherently at odds with each other. And in the last 3 chapters of the book, each by political scientists, we get glimpses into some of the ways that borders and migrations are socially constructed and are, quite frankly, very malleable to changes in policy. So in Doctors Edward Boyle and Naomi Chi's chapter, we go to Japan for an examination of how even some of the most insular or homogenous seeming cultures have their border and migration policy shaped by contingencies, historical contingencies, more than by essentialist qualities of cultural identity. And in her chapter, PhD candidate Franziska Fischer shows how the refugee crisis in Europe was constructed discursively in ways that undermined European principles of solidarity. And then in the last of our chapters, Claude Beaupre, PhD candidate at UVic here, takes us back to Canada to highlight some of the associations between mainstream news media and public opinion, discourse in mainstream news media, and how that is associated with shifts in public opinion. And the book is wrapped up, as we mentioned, with a conclusion by Emmanuel, our moderator, reflecting on the overall findings and raising questions about new directions in the research fields of borders and migration. So it has been a great learning experience for me. I hope that we have some great discussion and in what follows. And I guess I'll just pause there and turn it over.
So Melissa, maybe you can take a little less than Michael. He's gone 10 minutes. So
sorry about that.
It's well done. Melissa Kelly, please take the floor.
Thank you. And Michael, thank you so much for providing that great overview. I just want to say that it's been such a pleasure working on this project with you, along with Oliver and Emmanuel, all the chapter contributors, and of course, the University of Ottawa Press as well. So thank you so much to all of you for your time, dedication, patience, and above all, your wonderful contributions to this project. I'd also like to thank our audience for taking time out of your busy days to come and join us for the launch today. We really appreciate your support. Great to see so many people here. So now I'll just take a couple of moments to reflect on the comparative dimensions of the book. As Emmanuel and Michael already pointed out, our volume includes contributions from a number of outstanding Canadian scholars. And the 3 co-editors, Michael, Oliver, and myself, are, of course, all based at Canadian institutions. Nevertheless, we saw great value in including contributions from other parts of the world, such as Japan, Mexico, and of course, the EU, so that we could really situate the study of Canada's borders in a broader global context. We tend to think of Canada as exceptional in a number of respects. Indeed, when compared to the EU, the US, and Mexico, there is significantly less pressure on Canada's borders. That is to say, there are fewer people trying to cross Canada's borders without the required documentation. This is often attributed to Canada's geographical location. After all, it is rather hard to reach, and its highly managed system of migration governance, which tends to put a priority on selective migration programs that prioritize, above all else, skilled economic migrants. While Canada may be seen as a leader in terms of refugee resettlement, even with this, unlike most countries, it has the luxury of managing humanitarian migration flows for the most part and being selective about who it takes in. It is often said that Canada's managed migration system is the reason why Canadians, at least in comparison to citizens in many other countries, are overall quite open and accepting of migration, trusting that it is in the country's best interest to admit migrants that meet certain criteria. Indeed, immigration has been less of a polarizing issue in Canada than it has been in the US and in some European countries. However, one of the things our book really succeeds to highlight is that Canada is not unaffected by global trends. And like other countries, it's grappling with how to better govern mobility across its borders. While Canada may not be under nearly as much pressure as many other countries when it comes to people crossing at its borders, dynamics in the US, Mexico, and further afield have led Canada to experience heightened flows of undocumented border crossings in Manitoba and Quebec over the last 10 years, raising considerable public concern. As Oliver's chapter shows, Canada, like many other countries, has also become a destination for numerous temporary foreign workers who, as we learned through the pandemic, may make essential contributions to Canadian society, but nevertheless often lack many basic rights. So taking all of this into account, the book that we've produced has shown how Canada struggles, just as many countries do, but particularly democracies in the global north, to balance economic and humanitarian interests. Like other countries, Canada is being faced with questions concerning who should and should not have the right to access the country, what rights migrants should or should not have on arrival, and how all of this should be enforced and managed. The book also shows how Canada has adopted similar strategies as other countries to managing migration across its borders. One strategy the country uses is international agreements, such as the First Safe Country Agreement, to limit asylum claims in Canada. And I won't say too much about that here, as I know this is something probably both Scott and Asad will discuss in detail shortly. Canada has also followed other international border management trends, such as forming public-private partnerships and implementing new technologies to more efficiently manage the flow of people in and out of the country. Suffice it to say that by adopting an international comparative perspective, with this book, we have shed light on some of the key migration issues facing Canada, while also showing how borders function more generally. I think it is through this broader international understanding of the relationship between borders and migration that we can better grasp in a more nuanced way the challenges and issues facing Canada's borders today. And with that, I'll pass things over to Oliver. Thank you very much.
Oliver.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and a warm welcome also from my side to all of you. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure sharing what we've accomplished over the past years. And I took on the probably impossible task to speak to the conceptual framework of the book in 5 minutes. And what I can do and offer here as a migration scholar is to give you a sense of how two fields of literature speak to each other that often work very much in silo. And most of you are academics, and you know how difficult it is often to get different literatures to deeply engage with each other. So as you've already heard from Emmanuel a little bit, one of the key aspirations of this book is to bring together different kinds and traditions of scholarship that are so clearly linked to each other. And even if you start thinking about migration, it is about crossing borders. It is about requiring these borders to govern cross-border mobility, and in very fundamental ways, migration is governed by and also defined by borders. International movements of people, like international trade, happens through borders and not without them. So the territorial line, that is the starting point. But what we try to do in the book is to give this account more complexity, in particular looking at migration and border policies as being related through processes and practices of controlling mobility. And this is something that surely happens at the border. So there is the line, we know all this border installations, we can go there, and we know how violent and at times lethal borders can be as places of controlling migration, cross-border mobility. We just heard, you probably have read this on the news as well, another tragic incident of refugees in the Mediterranean capsizing and many of them drowning. So borders as demarcation lines between states can have this fundamental controlling and also violent effect on people's aspirations to go from one place to another. At the same time, we also see an enabling effect of well-managed borders, and that's something that you just heard from Michael, that states provide recognition of those people who try to cross borders. You need a legal form of acceptance. You need a permit to stay. And in a way, well-managed borders can facilitate migration. So in this respect, this slightly oversimplified notion that borders only restrict and prevent cross-border mobility, international migration, is not correct, but rather what we need is often well-managed borders to facilitate this. That's often lost in oversimplified discussions. The other, so one is control of borders, which not only happens at site, but in a way extended into the territories of different states. And that brings me to the second point, I think, that provides a kind of conceptual framework for our book, which is to look at borders in a deterritorialized fashion, to say it is not only controlling mobility at the site, at the demarcation, at the border, but we also have the border extending its reach and its impact on excluding and including people far beyond the actual site of where two states are separated. So borders also are places where social exclusion and marginalization are reproduced, anti-immigrant sentiments are generated and sustained over time. And Michael briefly mentioned my chapter on temporary foreign workers. What I show there is, sure, it is, the borders where entry, as the entry point, where those people who seek temporary foreign work in Canada need permission and come in. But really, the border extends into their daily life, whether they have access to union representation, to fair pay, to see some of their fundamental human rights respected. It has to do something with bordering practices that are not only at the border itself, but that infiltrate and shape political and social practices. So in this respect, the border conceptualized through this lens becomes far more fluid, but also potent in terms of reproducing not only the physical restriction across borders, but also the legal and symbolic boundary markers that are associated with borders. And maybe one last point here in terms of the meaning of borders also in migration studies. Borders are also places to negotiate belonging and collective identity. So you probably have heard at length attempts to politicize the border in political discourse, to describe the border as a place that defines who is legitimately an insider and outsider, who can legitimately belong. And so it is not by accident that the performative act of protecting the border and securing the border has been a recurrent feature in right-wing populism's attempt to politicize migration. So there's another link that the border plays a critical role in a way, the politics of migration and the exclusionary effects that securing the borders have. And again, that comes back to something that I think now is a good segue into Scott's reflection on international migration and the way that the international community tries to protect and regulate these borders. Right, Emmanuel, I hope I haven't exceeded much of my time here.
Outstanding, right on time. Thank you so much. Scott, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Oliver, for that segue in, and of course, Michael, for all your hard work, and the other editors on this volume. As both Oliver and Michael alluded to, I'm an international relations scholar, and so I'm focusing on the global governance of migration. And of course, from this perspective, borders are necessarily international. We often think of borders as sort of the community defining its inside and outside, but those borders require recognition by others. And so there is no border that is not sort of international. And so in my chapter, I look at the global governance of migration and situate Canada's response to this global set of regimes to understand Canada's position. In part, it's perhaps a mild critique of Canada's self-gratifying depiction of itself as a champion of migrant rights, and which I argue is mostly a result of a very fortunate geopolitical situation that allows it to govern its borders in the way that it has. But when we think about the global migration regime, it's very important to recognize that it's a highly decentralized and fragmented system. There's not a single global migration regime. There is a series of interconnected regimes that are institutionally, legally, and normatively in tension with one another as the international community attempts to govern multiple modes and forms of migration, and bring together multiple principles behind that, right? So we have, for instance, attempts to govern economic migration or family reunification or refugees, smuggled and trafficked persons, visitors, international students, tourists, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. And so the types of people that seek to cross borders are highly varied. And in the international system, there's been an attempt to govern each of these as though they're distinct, even though there's that introduces all kinds of tensions. At the same time, this international governance attempts to combine multiple principles and try to make them work together. Obviously, state sovereignty is one of the foundational principles behind the concept of borders itself, but it's not the only principle. There's a strong human rights component here. Many of the international conventions or agreements on migration emphasize the importance of a human rights-based approach, whether it's the refugee regime or migrant workers or any number of movements. And so you have this tension between a human rights-focused approach and a state sovereignty approach. You also have a tension between an embedded liberal approach that seeks to free up movement for some people, particularly high-skilled workers, and highly restrict the movements of others, and at the same time ensure economic protection for domestic industries and domestic workers. So you have all of these tensions built into an international system that is attempting to govern this very complex human phenomenon of migration across borders. And this, of course, has led to specific international legal frameworks that often work in tension with one another. So, for instance, we have the Convention on Refugees and the different protections offered to them, which I'm sure others will speak to. But you also have a convention on smuggling, for instance, and efforts to combat smuggling necessarily reduce protection for refugees, as many refugees require smugglers to help them across international borders. And so you have these tensions built into the system. But I think one of the things that I emphasize in this chapter is that fragmented, contradictory, decentralized system is not an accident. It's not it hasn't been produced because states sort of have blundered into their attempts to govern international migration. This is an intentional system of fragmented and contradictory principles, because some states benefit immensely from that system. And Canada is one of those states. And so I depict Canada here then as a benevolent status quo state. And what I mean by that is it's status quo in that it works tirelessly to protect the existing system, to resist fundamental changes that would enhance the right of workers and migrants in their claims against, migrant workers against the state, for instance, right? It wants to preserve the ability of individual states to determine their own migration regime and to engage in bilateral agreements with other states to, I think in Oliver's chapter goes into this, in terms of, let's say, temporary foreign workers, for instance. So Canada benefits from the existing system. And when I look at the different frameworks, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Migrant Workers and Their Families, for instance, Canada strongly opposed this convention and worked very strongly against its passing. Now, it has passed, but it and is technically in effect because it has achieved the required number of signatures to go into effect. But the reality is very few or no destination countries have ratified that convention because of the way it undermines the ability of states to determine their own, or this is their perception, of course, to determine their own migration policies. And I contrast that then with Canada's approach to the global compacts, the two global compacts that were, in essence, created in response to the refugee crisis that Emmanuel and others have alluded to. And Canada was this champion of this approach. I argue mostly because those compacts are tailor-made for Canada. They preserve the existing system, and they enhance Canada's standing in the world by presenting Canada as a leader who can provide policy prescriptions for other countries, as a way then of internationalizing Canada's approach to managing migration and refugees. And so not surprisingly then, Canada played a pivotal role in that agreement and continues to champion those agreements. Now, of course, I think those agreements were likely dead on arrival, to be quite honest. But that's at least Canada's approach to it. Now, in the chapter, I go into a bit more of the pressures Canada faces over its multilateral approach and pressure from the United States to increase security of its borders. But I know that I'm out of time and I don't want to drone on here. But the emphasis then in the chapter is really about situating Canada's response to global migration governance and identifying the very fortuitous geopolitical position it finds itself in to benefit immensely from the current system, able to cherry pick workers from around the world, doesn't really have to worry about its borders so much. We have the Roxham Road controversy, of course, where there's this one mode of entry into Canada, but if you compare that globally, it's such a tiny movement, and yet Canadians are all worked up about it. And I think it speaks to this privileged position Canadians occupy in this global sphere. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Scott. So now we have Asad Kiyani. Please take the floor.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And thanks to Michael, Melissa, and Oliver and for inviting me onto this project and doing all the hard work of editing the book. And thanks, Scott, for such a great segue into what I wanted to talk about, which is the Safe Third Country Agreement. And as a lawyer who's really concerned with why this agreement exists, and that's a question my students ask every time I teach immigration law, is like, why would the United States ever even agree to this Safe Third Country concept? Because it seems like all the costs are placed in the US, which is most of the border crossers at the Canadian-US border are coming from the United States into Canada. They're all going to be sent back to the United States mainly, and this was known at the time the agreement was signed. So what's in it for the US? And if you ask that question, I think it becomes clear why this agreement exists. And it has very little to do with safety for the asylum seekers. But that's not how the act is described. It's a safe third country. The United States is supposed to be a safe place. And my chapter really addresses this idea that the point of the act is not to ensure that asylum seekers look for refuge in the first safe place they can find, that is the United States in this case, but it's really there to reduce the number of people crossing the border from the United States into Canada. That's the purpose of the act. It's not to encourage people to find safety anywhere else. It's strictly to limit the number of people crossing that border and trying to claim asylum in Canada. And I argue that this is evident if you look at how the United States is described or understood to be safe by the Canadian government, or rather how it's not understood to be safe and not described as safe. There's just silence about whether or not the United States is in fact a safe place for asylum seekers. So there's no real regard in the operation of the STCA, the Safe Third Country Agreement, as to whether the US is safe for any given person, or even the extent to which the US implements the relevant human rights instruments that govern the rights of asylum seekers. As Scott said, this is a question that involves one of the principles involved here, of course, in international migration, is international human rights. The Canadian government has never released its basis for deciding the US is safe, even at the height of Trumpian policies of jailing children in cages where they're abused or simply lost, or from which they cannot find their parents when they're finally released because no one forgot to write down who the parents were and how to find them and stuff like that. The Canadian government never wanted to answer those questions because it would be a very difficult question to answer. How is this place safe when it is doing these things to these people? And I think that really ties into what Scott is saying here, that Canada has a real benefit in preserving the status quo. And anytime there's been an increase in migration or asylum seekers coming across the border, we've seen that as a destabilizing threat to the status quo. We've seen that as the actual lack of safety, if anything, in this process, in this regime. It's the lack of safety for that status quo. So from the Canadian perspective, what we have right now, in terms of a firm or rigid border there with the United States that tries to limit the number of asylum seekers come into this country from the United States, it's really safe. It's really good for us. It's a scenario that works. And the way I like to think about it is that Canada wants to have all the benefits of international migration, but bear as few of the costs as possible. And the STCA is one way of doing this, right? I think Scott did a great job of describing how that might operate. The other piece of this, though, right, there's two other pieces. One is, to go back to this idea of safety and who benefits and who's safe and who's unsafe. The only time the idea of safety really comes into play is when Canada portrays asylum seekers themselves as unsafe in the context of the Safe Third Country Agreement. That is, they are unsafe because they threaten the state's integrity by illegally crossing the border. So there's something about their nature that makes them unsafe for us. There's a lack of safety because the volume of the claims will threaten the system, right? And we all know that systems and stabilities are things that immigrants are really obsessed with preserving because, as Scott said, they work for them. And because these asylum seekers threaten genuine refugee claimants who, quote unquote, follow the rules, right? So there's something here about asylum seekers crossing the border irregularly, who are somehow disturbing the rights or abilities of other genuine claimants to enter. And we know that these are malicious people because they do this all intentionally. And the chapter outlines a little bit of this idea of crimmigration, that is the criminalization of migration. And I think if you look at crimmigration again, what you'll see is that there's this question of having all the benefits without bearing the costs of engaging this criminal system, a quasi-criminal system at the border. So you criminalize the refugees conceptually, which allows you to enact more punitive measures, including like automatically returning them to places where they are really unsafe. And that's a very criminal law kind of idea, which is my other area of research, is criminal law. But one of the joys of being an administrator in the government immigration departments is that you don't have to implement any of the protections that come along with applying criminal law or quasi-criminal law processes. So you can follow those policies that are very similar to criminal law, but there's no procedural guarantees that are owed to asylum seekers. And as Donald Galloway's chapter alludes to, part of this is the deference of Canadian courts to Canadian policymakers. And it compounds in unfortunate ways that really threaten the actual safety of the asylum seeker who is supposed to be safe in the place we're returning them to. The reality is that actual safety of actual asylum seekers matters very little to the STCA. The last point I'll make is briefly this. These ideas are ideas that spread across the world, and what's really revealing is that in the current climate in the United States, you see the United States now has adopted its own version of safe third country as a concept to apply to its own southern border. And it's intriguing because of the very obvious parallels to what's happening on the northern border, but also because of who's implementing it. And I think it's really indicative of the systemic nature of migration regimes, that it doesn't really matter if you have a Democrat in power in the United States or a Republican in power in the United States. Deportations are going to be at very high levels, and securing the border is going to be a very high priority. And the fact that Joe Biden is interested in doing something that basically reproduces what the Safe Third Country Act has been doing for Canadians, or for Canada rather, is really illustrative of the potency of these concepts. States to find whatever tools they can to ensure that they, again, gain the benefits but don't bear the costs of migration. I'll leave it there. There's a lot more to be said about what's happening legally with STCA and other things, but I think that's probably enough for now.
Thank you so much, Asad. So as I wrote in the chat, if you have questions or comments, please signal it in the chat so that I can give you a chance to raise your question. You can either write the question or the comment in the chat, or you can actually just signal that you would like to take the floor and ask a question to our co-editors and authors, and I will be delighted to help you raise the question and to moderate the discussion on the book. And to get things started, I would like to actually ask our editors and the two authors that we've just heard whether they think that this whole issue of mobility with right or mobilities without right, which we have documented in the book, is something that will have or may have a resolution. As Asad pointed out there, and actually Scott as well pointed out, there is a real, in a way, policy economy there. And there is, for certain states like Canada, it's basically a way to download the cost of certain policies to other countries. So it's kind of interesting to raise the point here. So okay, Olivier, please take the floor.
Just one quick remark, and I'm following up from Asad as well. I don't have easy solutions for this, but I think it's worth underlining of how fundamental the political and ethical challenges are that we face with governing borders and treating in particular those who are in need of support and of basic protection. I think, how to deal with irregular migration will be one of the fundamental political issues of the 21st century. Look at climate change, right? We see this currently in Europe. Europe hasn't found a proper way to react to the human tragedy that we see unfold on a daily basis in the Mediterranean Sea, right? So I think that will be an ultimate test, in particular for liberal democracies that in a way cherish human rights, but in their border regimes often deny this very access to fundamental protection. So that just underline what we've just heard. But I think it's worse, it's border studies might seem, something quite, limited, but I think in terms of its implication, it poses fundamental political challenges. Thank you.
Any one of you would like to add to this? Asad, Scott, Melissa, Michael?
I don't. To me, it seems like a sort of a race or a struggle between tendencies towards democratization on the one hand and tendencies toward more sort of politics of nationalist populism. And these two forces are kind of contending. I think democratization is an interesting way to look at it because any sort of equitable solution, I think, should not be imposed and probably would have all sorts of problems being imposed from above, but should come from below as societies decide to democratize the way their borders are governed. And that just means that all those who are affected by the governance of borders should have a say in how those borders are governed. If borders are instruments for good governance, then they need to take account of all those impacted by them and not just those who are have the right nationality. So I'm not sure if Scott or Asad or Melissa has any follow-up to that.
Scott?
Sure. I mean, I don't mind following up in that I think the efforts starting in the 1970s to create this UN Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers, for instance, that this opposition to the rights of migrants is long-standing. It's certainly not new. In fact, I would argue it's been the defining feature of sort of global governance of migration, more or less since the founding. Even the Refugee Convention, I'm sure Asad could certainly speak to this, that Canada was resistant to sign. Canada did not want to sign on to any obligations that would impose responsibility or rights of people to enter into Canada. And so I think this is a long-standing concern. It's certainly not new. It's being emphasized again, given the current migration numbers. But I think it's a constant and consistent feature, and we should expect it to continue, unfortunately.
Okay, I have a question. So Jules Soupeau, please take the floor.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, everyone, and congratulations for launching the book. It is really exciting, and I'm sorry that we couldn't do it in person because of the snow. And thank you so much for presenting it to us today. I have a question related to what, Michael, you said in the introduction, when you discussed why we should not oppose borders and migration, but find a model of good governance. And after hearing the intervention and screaming the rest of the book and hearing the first round of questions, I feel like the collective work that you are presenting us is showing how borders are enabling the reproduction of racial capitalism on a global scale, and that we see an escalation in repressive and violent regimes, especially since the so-called 2015 crisis, and that states are increasingly engaging in cooperation in criminalizing immigration. So if that is the case, I wondered where we can find a case of governments, good governance and democratization, and if there is a model somewhere, and if you allow me to be a little bit provocative, would it be among the non-state actor, the humanitarian, the anarchist, the abolitionist, the solidarity movement? And if you want, I can give you examples in Canada or Europe. When those movements may be on the front line of helping people affected by the violence of border regimes, with no regard for the law and policy that actually criminalize migration.
So, Jules, we didn't hear your question very well, but I think we may have an answer from Michael, if I read the screen well.
I heard a lot of the context of that, and I think you're asking about the tension between. No, could you?
My question essentially, can you hear me?
It's in and out.
It's Ubic Wi-Fi that I'm blaming right now.
The question is in the
I
chat
see it.
now.
I see it.
Yeah.
Great. Let me just read this out for folks. After hearing all the interventions and skimming the rest of the book, I feel that your collective work is showing us how borders enable the reproduction of racial capitalism on a global scale, and that we see an escalation in repressive and violent regimes, especially since the so-called 2015 crisis actually caused by imperialism, indeed, and that states are increasingly cooperating in criminalizing migration. Yes. If that's the case, I wonder where we can find a case of good governance and democratization. Is there a model somewhere? And if you allow me to be a little provocative, isn't it among the non-state actors, the humanitarian, the anarchists, the abolitionists, the solidarity movements? If you want, I can give some examples in Canada or Europe when they're on the front line of helping people affected by the violence of state borders regimes with no regard for laws and policies that criminalize migration. Thank you, Jules. I don't have a great answer. I certainly am maybe a little bit more skeptical, maybe even a bit more cynical about the prospects of this going in good directions anytime soon, because it seems that so much of the world is currently on the wrong track in all of the sorts of indicators that might point to real models on the ground or real seeds of movement toward a more just and equitable sort of global governance approach to a right to movement around the world. And I don't see any, I'm not aware off the top of my head of a good case to identify as exemplary. And one thing I would just point to is in the literature, there is a bit of a tension. There are those in border studies and migration studies who are urging for a universal right to migrate and more open borders, who are very concerned with linking that reformist or maybe relatively moderate goal with a more radical vision of no borders. And of course, no borders or a borderless world taken literally is a stateless world, because as long as there are different political jurisdictions, they're going to come up against each other, and where they do, there's going to be a border or a seam zone or an interface where one jurisdiction connects to another. So some in this debate say, let's stop talking about borderless world, because you're basically signaling to the public that you're calling for the end of governments. But others in the literature say, well, hold on, we sort of need these shock troops out there. Those who are in the abolitionist movement are setting the agenda and moving, pushing the case and expanding the space for discourse in a way that makes possible maybe more moderate goals of just working through the system to reform it and make borders a little bit more porous that way. So beyond that, I'm not sure if I've addressed your question in any satisfactory way, but would you like to follow up with that?
Yeah, maybe it's not, my question is not necessarily at the theoretical level, but more at the practical level, because it exists in practice. Like organizations are actually doing things in the field right now. And so I wondered if, when we look at where can be found a good example, we're not looking at people doing things. But I feel like there's so much, like the border regimes are so violently changing right now. There's so much happening, and as you said, it is not necessarily going in the right direction. So maybe it's in the practice, it is in the fact that people are already trying to find solutions on their way without having necessarily the power of a state. That maybe we can find another example if it is a good governance that we want to find.
Maybe just one quick point here. You know, if you look at the European Union, you could argue that the border regime that they have established, also with a view to creating some kind of transnational political community, is an example of well-governed and porous borders. At the same time, this very European Union that is working hard at eradicating the exclusionary effects of borders within its own community has established quite aggressive forms of protecting its outside borders, right? So you see this very paradox at work here. But I think the European Union would be an example of how borders can be governed also to the benefits of those who try to cross them.
God, take the floor also on this, and then I have 2 or 3 more questions.
Sure, and I think it's a great question. It opens up a great debate about the nature of borders themselves. The only thing I wanted to add is that if you look at some social movements in the United States, the concerns I have around non-state-based movements concerning the governance of migration is not just the groups of people you've identified that we might identify with a progressive approach. We see vigilante militia-based groups enforcing border restrictions because they think the state is not sufficiently repressive. And so I'm sympathetic to the idea that we need to support the rights of migrants toward a humanitarian approach or a human rights-based approach. But I'm very worried about the erosion of the rule of law in governing our approaches to borders, because what's growing in the United States, and I fear in Canada, is vigilante militia-based approaches to migration governance that pose a real challenge to democracy at its core.
Thank you so much, Scott. So we also have a question from Tatiana Shaban from Belarus, a non-resident fellow at CFGS and with big on Eastern borders. And Tatiana asked me to read the question. I am interested in the development of the concept of trust in border governance. Territorial borders, unlike traditional territorial borders, follow a logic of the functionalist or post-functionalist bordering processes and development of trust among numerous border actors. Is it possible to reconcile that logic between, roughly speaking, East and West? By East and Eastern territories, I mean Russia with its logic of territory and domination of power in China. Anybody wants to address that question?
I don't. It's I don't know. It's a very difficult question. So it's the question, if I could just paraphrase to walk through it. Is there hope of a trust-based global governance of borders in an era where you still have these sort of old-fashioned nationalist, imperial sort of territorial powers? I guess my response is I don't know. And I don't know, the concept of aterritoriality, I'm a little bit curious as to what that's doing in the question. I think that the concept of aterritorial borders is fascinating because it draws our attention toward, I guess that's exactly what it's doing in the question. The concept of aterritorial borders reminds us that borders and bordering is not just bound to those international territorial boundary lines, as it can happen deep within states or far away from state borders, or not even bound to geography at all. So I guess one of the things of the 21st century is we're in an era of contradictions. So even as borders are increasingly sort of liberated from those lines on the map more than ever, often in sort of functionalist and sort of almost, in a myriad of ways, the borders can be ascribed to objects and to data and to movements at a time when we're still seeing this sort of old-fashioned 20th century, 19th century hard territorial approaches. I'm not sure they can be reconciled, but they certainly seem to be coexisting.
And maybe let me just add to you, Michael, that one of the paradoxes is that we see a revival of this, what you describe as 19th century territory-based focus on borders, also in legitimizing conquest and military warfare in the attack of Russia on Ukraine, right? So that is, on the one hand, we see this deterritorialization and the execution of border control beyond this delineation, and then we have now armies fighting over a 10-kilometer territory for months on end, with an enormous and brutal effect on the population. So that's part of the fascinating but also troubling reality of how borders are addressed in the contemporary world.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I have a question from Victor Conrad. Victor, do you want to take the floor or should I read it? I think you might be able to take the floor. I see that you're right there. Otherwise, I'll read it. So Victor's question is, what are the key differences in public attitudes towards immigration in North America and Europe? How do these attitudes impact policies? Maybe this is more for Melissa, I don't know.
I would add to that if I could. My picture has been permanently deleted. My video has been deleted by the host, so you can't see me. I am anonymous. But what I was trying to get at with this is this line that connects between attitudes that get developed in the public toward migration and how those attitudes then translate into policies. My sense is that it's different in Europe than it is in North America. It's probably different in Canada from the United States. But how do those things translate? I mean, where's the link? How does it develop?
Who wants to tackle this?
There I am.
Maybe one of our European specialist editors could tackle that one.
Conrad, there you are. So you do exist in flesh and blood here. Good to see you, Victor.
Yeah.
I think one of the elements that I think Scott already mentioned is a different geography, right? And I think what we've seen is that Canada being relatively protected by the geopolitical reality of being in North America and having embarked on its multicultural experiment since the late 60s, early 70s, has developed a positive attitude, positive attitude towards migration that we don't see in Europe, right? And that has also shaped policy responses, right? With its recruitment system, even the United States is now looking at the point system as a way of selecting and recruiting immigrants with a view to how it benefits the economy. So Canada has embarked on a trajectory that describes immigration as positive, net positive, as having a benevolent effect on society at large. And so far this basic narrative hasn't been challenged. If you look at survey data, there's still a huge amount of support across the political spectrum for immigration, for multiculturalism. Very distinct from the European context, where European countries are pushed in this direction because of an aging society to be more proactive, allowing more immigrants in. We will see how this plays out in Canada. We see at the moment, discussion, and that that's, again, the American-Canadian context, if we see more irregular migrants coming across the border, this public attitude might be challenged quite quickly. And, you might see a major shift in the Canadian context. So far, Canada has been protected from some of the effects of international irregular migration, but we might see more of this coming, and then we might actually see also political entrepreneurs, and we have seen a little bit of this in the last political election, to embark on these anti-immigrant sentiments and make this their trademark. So so far so good to speak about the Canadian context in terms of a more also pro-immigrant, also pro-refugee approach, but Canada is not immune to the forces that we see play out in the United States and Europe in terms of the resurgence of right-wing populism.
Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. I want to add as well that in chapter 12, Claude Beaupré actually documents this quite well. She looks at she looks in the media, and she looks at, how the media has portrayed basically this mobility crisis and how it's been perceived by Canadians. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is how she documents, in the period of the election of the Liberal governments and the Conservative attitude towards this, there was kind of a shift in a way in Canadians' attitude, much more positive at the time, that obviously helped the previous government, the previous Trudeau government, to come in power. So it's also addressed it, but it's not comparative. It doesn't look as broadly to the EU in comparison. It just focuses on Canadian attitude. Now, I have another question from Benjamin Perrier, I believe. Benjamin, if you want to take the floor to read your question, please do. And Victor, thank you so much for your question as well.
Thank you, everyone. My question is this one. It's a technical and legal question. A small family, a parent and a child, manages to go to the United States from South America. This family manages to enter Canada at the legal entry point, example at Bellingham. What are the rights of this family and the duties of Canada? And what is the relevance of the Safe Third Country Agreement? Because as Asad said, we could imagine all the country has a legal buffer zone for Canada in terms of migration movement. So if Canada is managing this United States as a legal buffer zone, what are the consequences for Canada?
Thanks for the question. It's a very good one. I'll make some assumptions here just to fill in some blanks to make the STCA really relevant. So if this family manages to enter Canada at the legal entry point from the United States, and they try and claim asylum, then they're going to run into a real problem. There are some exceptions to the STCA, but basically, if you're an asylum seeker who's arriving in Canada from the United States, you are obligated to seek asylum first in the United States. The one obvious exception to this is if you are an American seeking asylum from the United States, or you're seeking asylum because of persecution experienced in the United States, there may be a way around this. But basically, the idea is that if you're coming from South America, you enter into America and you're saying, I'm fleeing violence in, say, Guatemala. The Canadian government will say, well, according to this agreement, you should seek refuge in the United States first. There will be some exceptions based on whether or not there are family members of that family in Canada and what their legal status is in Canada, but that's the basic principle of the Safe Third Country Agreement. That agreement only applies at these regular border entry points, which is why Roxham Road is so interesting, because Roxham Road used to be a border entry point. The CBSA stopped manning that border point and became an irregular entry point. So if that same family crosses over the Canada-US border at Roxham Road, the Safe Third Country Agreement no longer applies. Now, there's no guarantee of what will happen to them, but what is required on Canada's part is the government now has to provide for a refugee status determination proceeding. They have to try and figure out if these people are actually refugees or not. That's required by the Refugee Convention. So there's no obligation to find that they are refugees, but there is an obligation in that circumstance to at least try and figure out if they meet the definition as determined by Canada. So the US acts as a legal buffer zone in this way because we've signed this bilateral agreement that basically says to the US, you agree to be our buffer zone in this way. What does the US get out of it? Well, the exchange is intelligence and information sharing primarily. The Safe Third Country Agreement was signed and ratified after the 9/11 attacks, in the wake of lots of legislation about securitization of the borders, and the United States agreed to the STCA, which Canada had been pushing for many years. And it almost sounds crass, right, to say that the Canadians capitalized on 9/11, but in a way they did capitalize on 9/11 to secure the borders further. The 9/11 convinced the United States to agree to take back some refugee seekers, many more thousands than the Canadians would be taking back, in exchange for more information about Canadians, about people coming to Canada, more information about security, and more cooperation on border security and national security issues in toto. So that was the trade-off that was made. That's also why you're not seeing any movement right now about expanding the Safe Third Country Agreement to include irregular border entry points like Roxham Road. So there's many politicians now in Canada talking about the need to do this, and even the Liberal government seems to be suggesting that it's important to extend the STCA to the entirety of the border, not just illegal border entry points. As I've said for many years, since this was first raised, I guess in 2014, 2015, when it came to public attention, we can make all those demands that we want, but it's a bilateral agreement, and the United States has no incentive right now to change that. And I don't know why they would change that to apply it across the entire border without getting something more from Canada. And the US ambassador in the last week or so has been very clear that if there will be any changes to expand the scope of the STCA, it'll only be as part of a much broader package of agreements and negotiations with Canada, between Canada and the United States. Some of that will be strictly about migration, some of it will be about economic stuff, and some of it will be about national security stuff for sure. So that's where it is right now. And we'll see what happens. I will flag one more thing though about the STCA. There is a legal challenge before the Supreme Court of Canada. A decision should come sometime in the next few months about whether the Canadian government's determination of the United States as a safe place is in fact a valid one. That will be decided soon. So that may change everything I've just told you, but I'm with Donald Galloway. I'm suspicious about that actually happening. I'm very cynical about this. So my inclination is that nothing will change on that for the next little while.
Thank you so much, Asad. And I think we have no more questions or comments. So with this, I would like to thank all our participants today, the audience, and I would like to thank Michael, Melissa, Oliver, Scott, and Asad for taking the time to present parts of the book, and obviously Amanda and Jody for making this possible. And with this, we'll close this webinar. And again, thank you very, very much for taking part in the discussion today. We hope you will join us next time and keep in touch. Thank you again. Bye-bye.